This will probably be a series of talks and so forth. The content of this probably hasn't been preached in this church before because it's a little bit my view of the world from a scientific perspective and what I do in cognitive psychology and that. One of the things I think the assignment was to reflect a little bit on last week's talk and talk a little bit about why there's been a decline in the belief in God. And I talked, in my perspective, from diminished trust in organized religion, the schism between religion and science, and the inerrancy of the Bible and the inerrancy of science, and an uncritical deference to postmodern philosophy. So tonight's schedule. I want to explore scientific progress through the lens of color. I suspect this isn't something you were expecting, so I hope you enjoy that. What does it mean to be human? Perspectives through the lens of neuroscience. One of the things we'll talk about is there has been tremendous progress in the last 20 years to understand neuroscience in a way we could not do previously. And I think we need to be informed based on what 21st century science is teaching us. What does it mean to be human from the perspectives of evolutionary biology? We're going to talk a little bit about that and try to get more detail, because I think these sorts of subjects help us understand. And then, what does it mean to be human? Perspectives through anthropology. So what I'm trying to do is start drawing threads from multiple different disciplines together to try to address what does it mean to be human and how does that fit into the larger sense of God and religion and science. So as we do that, let's start with a contemporary perspective. If anyone is interested, this is a wonderful book, The Secret Lives of Color. It really is a delightful book where Cassia St. Clair goes through the history of colors and talks about them. And it really was eye-opening when you think about this, because to me, this is a metaphor for the Bible and our understanding of the Bible. If we look at this in the 21st century perspective, we learned that, in fact, there is a very small spectrum between about 350 nanometers and 750 nanometers that is called the visible spectrum. But there are waves delving back all the way from radio waves at the far end to gamma rays at the other end, an ultraviolet and infrared spectrum. Interestingly, there are certain insects and so forth that actually see in the ultraviolet range and other things we don't. Very few mammals actually have color vision. They have only 2 levels. We have 3. So we see in color. Other primates, lemurs, etc., see in color. So if you ever wondered, how does a tiger actually sneak up on any prey with orange and black stripes in an otherwise brown environment? It's because he doesn't look like orange and black to most of the creatures he's hunting. Then one of the other things we've learned is for most of our history, we thought about color from subtractive coloring. If we put a color down and then we put another color on top of it and we put another color on top of it, what color does it become? Muddy or black. So from an artist's perspective and all this, we started layering. And that's the process that came through. Now, who was it, trivia question, who was it that figured out about the additive color? Does anybody remember back to prisms? Sir Isaac Newton. And he took white light and found this whole spectrum, rainbows, etc., come about because of additive color mixing versus subtractive. So if we take that as our 21st century perspective, let's go back a little ways. So there's been paintings and drawings on walls of caves for literally 100,000 years. And they're drawn in the palette of brown and black because that's what they had. They had soot and other stuff, and that's what they drew on. The first real color that came into being was white, and that was about 2300 BCE. Now, unfortunately for those who like to look fresh and alive, they used the white paint for makeup, and since it was lead-based, it was not a good long-term solution. When we get to the time that's kind of contemporary to the Bible, one of the things is, as you guys know, as I just came back from Greece, and one of the books we were given is a book that was "The Sea is Wine Dark." What color is wine dark? I mean, I was in the Mediterranean. I did not see wine dark. So why does that come about? Well, it comes about because the color scheme of contemporary times at that was from lightest to darkest. So there was white on one end, there's black on the other, and then there was darkness in between. So things like green and blue, there was a discussion in this book. If you look at Homer and you read Homer, there were 170 references to black. There's 100 references to white. There was 16 or 13 to red, and fewer of the other colors, and 0 references to blue. There is a whole section, if you go into Wikipedia and you say, look at the blue-green controversy, because many languages, blue did not appear as a distinct color from green. There were shades of this back and forth. So now when you think about how things are reported and how things are talked about, if you're reporting colors in 30 CE, 100 BCE, you're going to describe things in terms of light and dark, not in terms of wavelength, not in terms of infrared, ultraviolet. The scientists at that time were not lying. They were not making things up. They were not trying to deceive you. They are trying to say things as they saw it to the best science and the best model possible. And again, this reflects back in the concept of heaven. Heaven was perfect in Aristotle's mind. It was perfect in Ptolemy's time because you looked and the North Star was always in the right place. The Big Dipper came around and was there and was permanent. Other stuff caused mischief. But we can only describe it, and that's what I'm going to talk about the rest of the day. You can only describe the narrative. You can only create the stories with the knowledge that you have. And so late 18th century writer Lazarus Geiger proposes that humanity's sensitivity to color occurs through the evolution of their languages. I would turn that around a little bit. I think the languages evolve to meet the needs. So when you think about this, when you look at a Monet painting could not have been painted in the 14th century. The colors didn't exist. The concepts didn't exist. Now, it turns out Monet could copy 14th century painting techniques much later. So as you look at this, we're going to talk about knowledge building. From philosophers' perspective, and gosh, that would be a deep dive, there's a lot of existential philosophy that talks that knowledge doesn't exist. This is the postmodernism I talked about, and why I think that is distracting. 2 other books that I thought were important to kind of bring some perspective. George Lakoff really wrote a lot about the metaphors we live by. One of my most favorite authors, Douglas Hofstadter, who I'll talk about next week as well, talked about surfaces and essence. Analogy is the fuel and fire of thinking. So what we're seeing is that very prominent cognitive psychologists and philosophers are understanding that we talk by analogy. We think about things by analogy and metaphor. And they're really central to human thought. Language helps form conceptual model and the narrative. So if you don't have the language, it's difficult to express it. Now, we're going to get in when I talk about neuroscience. There is a brand that says, well, if you don't have the language, you can't see it, you can't think about it, it doesn't exist. I'm going to posit that the neuroscience says that it's a recognition in the frameworks that does this. But it's really interesting to think about how language develops. So I think, this to me is fundamental to a lot of what we talk about in this church, that you take the Bible seriously, but not literally. Because that's where you start getting the dissonance, that you try to apply 21st century or 20th century frameworks back at the time of 300 BCE, 80 CE. They didn't exist. One of the very interesting books I read, I did not include it in this, was a discussion about Roman history and SPQR, and talking about how the great Caesars, most of their biographies were not written contemporaneous. They are written 100 years, 70 years after their death. So the idea we can apply 21st century or even 20th century reporting and bookkeeping, etc. So there's not this huge gap of things that we can go look at and say, well, what was happening at the time and what's the documentation? And one of the things that it becomes important in our discussions as we try to frame, that I want to frame, is the narrative is subjective. You're seeing it in your mind's eye. And we're going to talk more about that as we get into some of the neuroscience. And here's a book on neuroscience. It's very interesting to think about how we think and work. And this image is what's called a functional MRI study. And you can actually map the brain's activity in real time and seeing what parts of the brains are active and how they're working. And that's really helped us understand. So for instance, short-term memory lasts about 20 seconds. It generally relies on previous templates. So when I drove out to work today, I have millions of rods and cones in my eyes. I can see lots of stuff. But how often does this get updated? So how often do people think your vision gets updated? Hint, TV and movies. 30 times a second. You're not seeing things instantaneously at all times. It's getting updated. So you don't see jerkiness at 30 frames per second. You see even less if they go to 60 or 120 frames per second. It gets a little smoother. But we update. And so when I look out at this audience, I have this visual image that's imprinted of everybody sitting here. It'll last about 20 seconds and then I'll forget you guys are here unless I keep looking. But I'm getting hundreds of thousands of signals, but not everyone is getting in. And so the central part of the eye is where most of the color and most of the focus occurs. So as we drive, we see things and we have this framework. And one of the things that happens is you identify danger because it's a variation from what you were expecting. Your brain's anticipating. So we have billions of bits of information that come in that we don't retain. It's in our short-term memory, and unless it's important, it tends to blow through. Now there's a thing called your working memory, visual short-term memory, and that's what you can use with this functional magnetic resonance image. So you can do tasks and we can see what parts of the brains light up. And this is really kind of neat because what we learn in the expertise, I'm not going to go in it today, but experts' brains light up differently than non-experts' brains. They rely on things, and we'll talk a little bit about how they build. I have a 2.5-year-old grandchild. he has more brain cells than I do, but mine are a little more organized. His are flying around and readjusting all the time. And we're going to talk about, I'll be careful in using words like miraculous. But one of the things you learn when you get into neuroscience, people who are born blind use parts of their brain differently. It gets remapped and reused. That my 2.5-year-old grandson's brain is looking at things and going, I think that's a ball, no, it's a pine cone, creating new frames. And that reforms all of the time. And that's what's called plasticity. Now, as we get older, we have a little less plasticity as we do this. And learning is numerical. So as we talk about logos, that's numerical, verbal and visual spatial. So that's how we learn. Long-term memory is really where knowledge is stored. And knowledge is the practical or theoretic understanding of a subject. So again, to me, as we start getting into these kind of arguments in postmodernism, does knowledge actually exist? The answer is, in my mind, firmly yes. We have lots of ways to look at that scientifically. And then we talk about the fusiform face area. The fusiform face area is really kind of interesting. How many of you have ever held a baby? How does that make you feel? Why does it make you feel good? Does the baby actually look in your eyes? Yes. After a couple weeks, they look you square in the eye. And that releases endorphins. And that makes you feel good. And you develop a bonding with them. And that's born into our brains. The fusiform area looks at that. And they recognize the face. They don't know what a face is, how it works, but they understand and they're naturally attracted to it. And so we'll go into a little bit more of that when I talk about Tomaselli's work. So, getting to the salient points of this section. There's an inseparable link between memory, attention, and problem solving. So as we think about what we're talking about, we can't separate out the brain into little pieces. It's acquiring, storing, retrieving information. It is the engine of extraordinary performance. And I'll talk a little bit about how extraordinary that is in the larger scope. Now, this becomes a really important concept. Memory is representational, not a copy of reality. This is going to come up again when we talk about the facts, the honesty, and the truth. We see things in representation, and that brings in our own intrinsic biases, our frameworks, and our knowledge. So, in a sense, you can't see things if you don't anticipate seeing it. And I think this is also important. To develop deep memory, it's about creating vivid and emotional images. So, remember last time when we talked about mythos and logos? I think mythos is incredibly underappreciated by most people. The concept of logic makes perfect sense. But as we talked about, it's just the tip of the iceberg. You need the mythos to create that narrative, to create that visual spatial image that says, this is what's going on. In the books that I showed you on metaphors, a lot of the fundamentals go back to warlike phrases. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to do this. We're going to crush you at the football game. All those are metaphors that have meaning because people can ascribe to that. And as we try to learn and build, and I think this becomes important to me when we talk about 21st century education at a time of ChatGPT and generative AI. For humans, we have to create those vivid and emotional images that we carry forward, that depth. So experiential learning in my area is far deeper than book learning. So if you experience, if you think about it, if you reflect as you sit there, that helps. So, has anyone ever heard of the Flynn effect? I'm modifying this. The Flynn effect was described in the early 1900s about how we build upon previous knowledge. And so, in general, IQs across the world have been rising continuously from the time they've been measured. If we give the same test, the next generation will score better. A great example came up when my wife found some of her homework from 9th grade. And she thought she was pretty good in math. And my daughter looks at this and goes, "This is what we did in 6th grade." And that's why our IQs are getting better as long as we keep relying on what is taught and what is learned and building that. So the Flynn effect is what I'm saying with colors. We don't go back and say, folks, you have to discover what blue means. You can't write a sentence to describe the Mediterranean. You just have to describe it as dark wine. Think about the vivid imagery and how that helps. So as we do that, we build upon what we've learned. We understand. So one of the things we talked about in the heliocentric view of the world, Galileo said, you know, the proof that it's heliocentric are our tides. Tides are the reason I can prove it. Guess what? He was wrong. Tides are not heliocentric. They are geocentric. There's the moon's gravity. But he didn't understand that, but that was the best explanation. But we don't have to rediscover that in 2023. It's interesting, expertise doesn't have a greater depth or breadth of memory, but they just see things differently. And again, this is what I try to teach when I teach my medical students and residents. So expertise is stored in long-term memory. I'm probably not, who's heard of Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow? Okay, again, I'm always careful when people have won things like Nobel Prizes and I go, yeah, but they were wrong. You have to be a little bit concerned about what I'm talking about. Daniel Kahneman and Tversky wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And what they're saying is there's activities that you need to think slow about. You can't think fast. And so this is why when they say you shouldn't be on the phone when you're driving, because if you're distracted by the conversation, you're not seeing what's ahead of you. You're not reacting in your short-term memory. Now, that's true up to an extent, except when you gain expertise. So for me, when I started my cardiology fellowship and the first time I went to the cath lab, I didn't know anything. I didn't have any muscle memory. I didn't have any expertise. And my first job was to actually put a needle into a blood vessel. That was the sum total of what I could add to the case. Now, the attendings were doing lots of other things, and over time, you gain that expertise. Another example is the first time you drive. What are you looking about? What are you thinking about? Now that you've learned to drive, how do you do this? In our work, as we develop this long-term memory, we can bring it forward and we create more and more complex chunks. So one of the things that I think often gets misrepresented as we talk about human cognition is we talk that humans can only carry or think about between 4 and 7 units at a time. You can't memorize a lot of things and bring them back automatically. But what happens is we can build chunks. So the classic story of a chess master like Garry Kasparov is they often play sequential games of chess, and there'll be 60 people lined up. And they'll make a move, they'll go down, go back and forth. And the classic example is that he came back and he goes, "You moved a piece." And people said, "What? How did he know that somebody had cheated? How did they move a piece?" It isn't that he memorized every piece on every board. But what he did is he knew how to play chess. And he had his mental model of how he plays and what he sees and how he reacts to it. So what happened is he goes, "I know how I'm playing this game. I'm playing this hand. And I know what my next move is going to be. And when I see something that's disruptive, it strikes you as being abnormal." We did a large project at the Med Center. I spent 5 years looking at how to optimize the electronic health record. You may have heard that it's causing a lot of burnout among nurses and physicians, et cetera. And so we built this prototype. And what we did is we included this idea of big chunks. And so we took 2 large screens and we'd present this information to clinicians. And I was amazed how they could look at 2 30-inch 4K screens and go, "There's a problem right there." And it was, one of them is my computer scientist didn't know the difference between a fractured clavicle and a broken hip. And so they mistranslated it from one section to the other. And the number of clinicians, cardiologists who go, "Wait a minute, this isn't right." And that's because you can develop these large chunks of activity. That's why as you look at things, you say this rings true or it doesn't. And that'll be part of what we talk about next time. And the big thing is that the template theory solves the connection between long-term memory and working memory. This, to me, overcomes a lot of the bias that Kahneman and Tversky talks about. There is certainly bias that we have in place, but it's not there. So ultimately, experts create better schema. They can see and evaluate different paths in seconds, while novices follow a lot of irrelevant paths. You try a lot of things that don't work. There's real science behind how we become human. This is one of my favorite books. Michael Tomasello spent 25 years at the Max Planck Institute studying chimpanzees and bonobos and children, and really tried to understand the developmental differences between humans and what he termed our last common ancestors. As I read this book, the last common ancestor was probably about 4 to 6 million years ago. Since that time, chimpanzees have continued to develop. There was a lot of myths that we had in growing up. I can remember that only humans use tools. And then we find out, no, that's not true. We also learned that only humans kill other humans. And it turns out mother bears are very ferocious for a reason, and it's not us. There's a lot of meanness going on in the world. And so what he did is to try to understand why somewhere around 100,000 years ago we made this giant leap. And we've differentiated. And the basic thing is that you can try to train a chimp to a certain level, but they're incapable of human thought. And that, again, goes back to this kind of revolutionary thing. You're going, wow, we really are different. And there's some things I want to talk about in terms of that. So first off, physically, I'm pretty sure chimpanzees mature earlier and have a lot of skills that we don't have from a physical perspective. So they mature faster than humans. But our last common ancestors are intelligent. They can learn. They use tools. And they have a limited ability to cooperate. And this really is the beginning of, to me, some of the interesting things that come out of that. So the very thing that he talks about is they can only see self. Now, we talked about babies looking at faces and looking at each other and making eye contact. And as we look, we can all have eye contact. Now, if I suddenly look over there, everybody goes, what's over there that he looks at? We can communicate that way. So can chimpanzees. So what they did is they had experiments and they would set food. And there's an alpha and then the others. And what happened is if you put food over there and one of the non-dominant people goes like this, the alpha looks and goes, you're not getting that food, that's me. And they can see that and they can react. So now the other chimps get kind of and try to sneak around and do that sort of stuff. And there's some cooperation, but even mother chimps lose their maternal instincts at about 3 years after they're weaned. It's, okay, now you're off on your own. Now they do form some small collectives, but it's all, according to him, about self-interest. They don't have this larger scope of feeling. So as we look at this, what makes us human? First is, chimps and bonobos can only see objectively. They can only see the logic side of things. And I'm going to bring that up in 2 weeks when we talk about artificial intelligence and where it sits. But they don't have subjective reasoning. And so this allows us to have the difference between appearance and reality. And as we talked about, we typically see appearances, and then we feed back to develop our sense of reality. And we can identify false beliefs in this pattern. And this is present in 7-year-old children. Communication, understanding conventions and normative speech. So children learn to speak. Now, in artificial intelligence, you can learn that by feeding about 100 million parameters and now tens of billions of parameters and feeding them back and over and training. But kids don't need that much. They learn, and they learn the conventions. So they learn to speak, they learn to communicate, and they have their own personality coming very early. Another important thing is the concept of cultural learning. So they're instructed learning of generic information. One of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about the anthropology, there is the innate ability and then the culture that it's applied to. And when we look at similarities and differences, I'm going to try to propose that there's innate things and then there's cultural modifiers of those, because we then tend to see the world through that. The thing humans do is joint commitment. We can work together to do things. Prosociality. We have innate, inborn senses of fairness and reciprocity. Not cultural, but inborn. If you take a baby and put them in a hostile environment at 6 months of age, they sense that. They understand. They don't know what it means. They don't know why it's happening, but they're going, this is not normal. When you put them in a warm, nurturing environment, they respond accordingly. And so these feedbacks are going on. And there is an innate sense in the vast majority of us about fairness and reciprocity. Now, unfortunately in the world, we have people that don't have this skill very well developed. And innately, from a neuroscientific perspective, there are people who are asocial. That they, quote unquote, the psychopaths, they just don't have the same connections of other people. They don't respond the same, they don't see it. Other parts of their brain work very well. They don't have this fairness and reciprocity built in very well. Yes, but no. That's the point of this. So as we look at this, there's a culture around this. And what we're going to talk about next week is, for instance, in many of the Indian continent, there's a different culture. There's a different sense of priorities, importance, etc. But everybody has the same sense in their culture of right and wrong, fairness, and reciprocity. And as I get to this, we're going to talk a little bit about the anthropology. But it's innate in all of us. So you can study humans in different societies, different cultures, and between the time of birth and 6 years of age, they all develop the same sense. So how many of you have had a 3-year-old say, "This is not fair"? That's an innate sense. Now, that may be more chimp-like than we like. Social norms, enforcing norms, respecting possession is also innate. So they understand this. And finally, moral identity and guilt. Now, countryside's not big on the whole guilt thing, but it is an inborn sense. And we're going to talk about that. So, back to the Missouri Synod Lutheran concept of original sin. Growing up as a Missouri Synod Lutheran, we were hit by original sin. And the origins in that are really kind of interesting as we go about it. But I didn't really understand the concept until I started thinking about chimps versus humans. There was a special, and there was a troop of chimps, and it turns out there was a troop of bonobos that were kind of in their territory. And they went out as a group and slaughtered all the males and took the females and the children. Where have we seen that in human history? Yes. We see it repetitively, those sorts of behaviors. And this is really, as I read about this, the thing is, chimps can't go to a higher level. They can't see the community. They can't see the larger vision. They can't be the pro-social organization. And so as we go forward, and what we're going to talk about next week, is how do we build this into our human structure again in a little bit more. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about is The Dawn of Everything. Wonderful book. David Graeber, by all descriptions, unfortunately passed away of pancreatitis at the age of 59. What was interesting is he was an anarchist. And, to our attention deficit disorder type discussion, this allowed him to think and see the world in a different, more contrarian way. So this book proposes a new framework on the origins of social inequality. There's a whole new picture of human past and human possibility that seems to be coming into view. And it really doesn't resemble in the slightest these very entrenched stories going around and around. And what they were talking about is the utopian Adam and Eve world of the agrarian society where everything's divided equally and everybody blends into this. That does exist, but only because of social norms and survival. And so what they're saying is things did not evolve in a perfect balance. And it did not, and they propose it did not grow through the kind of traditional of we're hunter-gatherers, then we start doing crops, and then we start seeing some economy of scale. Then we start hoarding things, and then we need a military to protect it, and we need a leader who grows up and says, I'm going to protect you, and that's my job. And then you develop this hierarchical society, you develop slavery, you have inequality, etc. But they do a worldwide perspective, and it's really fascinating in terms of kind of what they designed and discussed and discovered, because there are a lot of very mature societies that didn't leave much of a mark because they didn't have written word on stones. They wrote things or had communication with woods. They built wood structures. Around Louisiana, there was a community in about 900 Common Era of a city of tens of thousands of people that were organized. In the Ukraine, there were similar, very large organizations and cities that existed well before the Roman Empire. In Japan, there was structures in place. And their point is they all have a lot of similarities and differences. One of the points they talk about is the indigenous people along the Pacific coast. What they posit is in Southern California, it was a very egalitarian society because you could get everything you needed yourself. You didn't need other people to help supply it. Once you got to about the Oregon coast, however, things got a little bit rougher, and then they started building some discrimination. And so the idea of a totem, which we think is great art, really was the development of a hierarchical society and the creation of inequality. So as we look at this, their real point is inequality is innate in power structures as they look at this. And humans have always struggled with that inequality. And it's not just guns, germs, and steel, as been kind of popular. And to our point earlier, environment informs culture. So the environment you live in, your norms, your caveats, all that come into play. One of the things I thought was an interesting story, when the Spanish came into Mexico, we always talk about how 760 Spaniards conquered hundreds of thousands of Aztecs, right? And then we gave them diseases, horrible people that we are. They go, no, that's not really how it happened, folks. It turns out that there were a bunch of tribes that the Aztecs suppressed. Now the Spaniards come in, and what happens? These people who are feeling suppressed say, hey, if we line up with the Aztecs, I think we can take, if we line up with the Spaniards, we can take the Aztecs down. And that's more likely what happened, is that this natural tendency came about. Another interesting piece that I thought was really kind of intriguing is what was termed the indigenous critique. And so the whole concept of European Enlightenment was about science and wisdom and all this stuff. But what happened, and the Jesuits came to kind of convert the indigenous people in the Americas. And they started conversations and they started recording things. And then they started taking them to Europe. So they were taking tribal chairs and taking them to the parlors of Paris and having conversations. Now, if you're a tribal chief at that time, especially in the Plain States, you had a fairly flat structure. There was you, and then there were the rest. But everybody had choices to be in that group or not, to join and split apart. So when they went to Europe and they saw the hierarchies, king, dukes, et cetera, they felt there was a lot of slavery, in a sense, in jobs and responsibilities, and there was a lot of hierarchy. And what they preached is being much more egalitarian. And so what Graeber and Wingrove talk about is that the idea of enlightenment was really strongly influenced by indigenous, what they refer to as Americandians, the American Indians, and their sense of individuality being important. And that led to that. So I think it's really been a very interesting read. And as I said, Graeber is an anarchist, and he said, humans love choice. They need the freedom to disobey. And so that is really kind of, as I set this up, a sense of where I think we want to go, or what I want to go, to try to bring this back to the concepts of right and wrong. Is it innate in us? Is it learned? Is it cultural? And then how do we deal with that? And then how do we bring that back into theology? One of the things, having never practiced this, I have no idea what time it is or how much more, but I'm open to questions and thoughts. Humans love choice, the freedom to disobey. I was going to have a slide of Starbucks and then bring up a slide of scooters. Why do scooters exist? Because it's not Starbucks. That's what happened in Mexico. That's what my point about the Spaniards. The Aztecs were in charge. They were the power structure. But there was a group that said, we're not Aztecs. And the Aztecs said, in a sense, we're better than you. You do what we say. But when they were given an opportunity, then they joined with the Spaniards to overthrow the Aztecs. And that's, I just think there's lots of examples as we look where we're all somewhat tribal. I was in the Netherlands talking about cardiac electrophysiology, and I was staying with a brilliant electrophysiologist by the name of Richard Hauer. And this was in Utrecht. And his wife says, and I said, they were talking at dinner, they said, where are you going next? And I go, I'm going to go visit this Hein Wellens in Maastricht. And she made an interesting comment that just floored me. She goes, that isn't really Holland. 70 miles away, Maastricht is the lowlands. She's from the highlands. That's not us. And that's human nature. There's things that draw us together. We're going to talk a little bit about orthodoxy and orthopraxy. There's a sense of building teams and how that works. So there's a reason that in China they do a lot of synchronized activities, because that builds a sense of us. That harmony, that working together, builds a mental model that says we're all in this together. And when you look at the Chinese culture, it's much more groupthink than individual think. They have a real problem with American individuality and what they consider American selfishness, because the good of the group should outweigh the individual. And that's where we get into challenges, I think, in a number of levels. And hopefully we can talk more about that next week. So, to kind of summarize, neuroscience, the brain doesn't process every input, but builds established, learned templates. So as we mature, as we gain knowledge, we build more and more complexity. If we go to school and we learn, we build complexity. And I think this actually comes up in our Bible studies. If you stop thinking about the Bible in 6th grade and you take that moving forward, and your framework does not get updated, then you're really susceptible to that sophomore student in high school who goes, that's not true. The Easter Bunny really doesn't exist. You build that up, and that's why I think we need to continuously go about science. We need to bring scientific inquiry in. We need to bring that sense of I might be wrong, but this is what I believe right now into this, because we have to continue to learn and grow. And as I said, we're born with an ability to recognize faces and bond, and that prosociality becomes important. And it's not our intelligence, but our ability to be subjective and cooperative that separates us from the chimpanzees. And as I said, culture informs our learned templates. So if you're brought up, as you were talking about, in a horrible environment, until you see a different framework, you can't understand. You have an innate sense it's wrong. You just don't know how to articulate it. I had a patient who had an abnormal heart rhythm that started when he was 5 years of age. He's now 45 years of age. He has never known not having an arrhythmia. So he assumes everything that is happening is normal because that's how he is established. And so those are the things as we grow and build and develop, and that sense of truth as we get back, of challenging, I don't think that this is right. That's how we grow. But I do think that there are universal themes that transcend time and location. I'm honestly a little bit bothered when people say, oh, that's a Western philosophy. You're just touting old white guys. Because when you look, and this is really what the dawn of everything talks about, there's universality to humans. The book about becoming human was not based on just certain group of people. It was studied across all sorts of domains. And that to me is an important message. And I'll try to bring that in some of the work with Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama's concept of one humanity. So next week, right and wrong and becoming fully human. So thank you very much for your attention.